This is the briefing for Friday, June 9th. This was a pretty interesting week in the stock indices. Really had some mixed things going on in terms of intermarket divergences and internal divergences. Next week's going to be a pretty interesting week also. We have on Wednesday, I think it is, we have CPI numbers coming out, and we have a Fed announcement on interest rates. So anything can happen next week. But all we can do today is analyze the information the market has given us up through the close of today. Now, it was a pretty interesting week, and I want to show this pretty carefully because if you remember, we were in a pretty good rally in terms of the NASDAQ, and this is the Qs, and the S&Ps were following, but not quite to the degree that the NASDAQ was going up, and the Russell was certainly lagging. But on Wednesday of this week, we certainly had a change in what was happening. Now you can see breadth was diverging. Breadth was increasing going into this high. We got a slight divergence right here at the high, and then we had this rotation that started before we saw this breakout. Now this is Wednesday's trading, June 7th. So you can see what happened in the spiders. This is Wednesday's trading in the Qs or in the NASDAQ, and you can see what happened there. So it was pretty interesting to see what happened. And more importantly, looking at Wednesday's trading in the Russell, we had a pretty good move up, but the Russell was increasing dramatically over the other two indices for most of the week last week. Now, breadth in the Russell was fairly strong. Then we got to this high, and you can see that there was a slight divergence right here in Russell breadth, and that led to the decline that we saw here. And this looks like a three-step counter trend rotation, at least at this point in time. And then, of course, breadth sold off as well. So it's going to be interesting to see what happened. Now, when we get to the longer term charts, I'll move to a daily chart now. And you can see this is what happened with the spiders this week. You can see they moved up, and then right at this 430 area paused. Now we exceeded that slightly today, but you can see that we came back down and closed right at the 430 area. You can see breadth was declining after we got to this high. Breadth was declining and declined all through this rotation for most of the week. Volume was really nothing to write home about, falling off. And while earlier in the week, 52-week highs minus 52-week lows was positive and increasing, we had a little bit of a decline going into today's trading. And in the, I think it was in yesterday's or Wednesday's briefing, I talked about the fact how the internals appeared to be strengthening within the indices before we got this move in the middle to the latter part of the week. Now this is the Qs, and you can see the Qs are well above this 335 area, and then pausing for most of this week. You can see breadth was declining for the latter part of the week, and volume was really nothing to write home again as well. But this was the amazing part. This was the Russell, the IWM. You can see this rotation here, and keep in mind that the other indices were rotating and pausing at their upper extremes. The Russell was rotating and pausing at its lower extreme, and then all of a sudden we had this huge breakout, an attempted breakout on I think this was on Friday, and then we had pause on Monday. Tuesday we got this breakout, and Wednesday we had a follow through, and then Thursday and Friday you can see that we've paused slightly in the Russell, breadth falling off in the Russell as well. In terms of overbought and oversold, we're really neither place. We're slightly or trending towards oversold, but we're basically neutral, really nothing to write home about there. But in terms of volume is really interesting. I'm not sure what happened here. This was on May 31st, and I'm not sure why we got that spike in volume. The same thing happened in the NASDAQ right there. But you can see how volume has fallen off, and really not anything to write home about. NASDAQ volume was increasing nicely, and then we got to the beginning of or the end of May, and now volume in the NASDAQ has fallen off pretty dramatically. Now, I want to look at where we are on a weekly basis. This is the spiders on a weekly basis. So you can see the rotational pattern they were in. You can see the next level of resistance is going to be this 435, 440 area. And you can see, if you can see this on your charts or in this recording, there's a buying tail right there and there's a selling tail right there. That basically suggests that that neither buyers nor sellers could gain control of the market today. So it's a pause basically in front of a very important news week. Volume was down slightly between last week and this week in terms of the spiders. And of course, breadth from last week to this week was pretty negative. So you can see the big divergence. This is the high from last week. This is the high from this week. We put in a slight new high. And if you look down, you can see that's volume, or that's breadth from last week, and that's where breadth is this week, even on a higher high that we've seen. Now I'm going to change this to the Qs, and you can see how the Qs have really outperformed the other indices. And then of course we got this little bit of a sell-off, and then a day where neither buyers nor sellers could gain control. This week, I'm sorry, but last week we had this move that paused as well. So we've basically had 2 weeks of pause after this breakout in the Qs. Volume ticking up slightly this week in the Qs, very interesting. And then of course, if I move to the Russell, you can see the Russell this is the rotation we looked at on a daily basis. This is the rotation that it's in on a weekly basis. So you can see the huge divergence between the Russell now and the NASDAQ and the S&Ps. Look at volume. Volume last week here, volume this week in the IWM. Really very, very interesting to see volume coming in on that. Now, probably the most important thing is looking at the NYSE, the number of shares, percentage of shares trading above their 50-day moving average and their 200-day moving average. You can see this is what happened this week. We just exploded higher. And you can see the same thing with the 200-day moving average. We just exploded higher in terms of those companies that are trading above their 50 and 200-day moving averages. Now, that suggests to me that the rally, even if it was a pause, that there was some strengthening within the indices last week, because we had more and more shares that were beginning to trade higher above their 50 and 200-day moving averages on the NYSE. Looking at where we are with the S&P, you can see the same thing happened with the S&P. This is 50-day moving average. This is the 200-day moving average. And you can see that even though we paused inside this area, you can see what happened with shares that are now trading above their 50 and 200-day moving averages. And then in the NASDAQ, we had the exact same thing happen. You can see the pause in prices, but you can also see how this exploded higher. And the one that's really interesting is the Russell. This is the Russell, and you can see what happened here. The Russell reached a point on Wednesday of 75% of the shares in the Russell being above their 50-day moving average, and almost 60% above their 200-day moving average. To me, that tells me that it was a broad-based, basically, move in the Russell. But the other indices basically tell me, I'll look at the NYSE because it contains more stocks. But you can see that even in a pause phase, that the number of shares trading above their moving averages was increasing, and increased pretty dramatically. Now, we had a little bit of a decline in today's trading, which I guess is to be expected. But anyway, going back to where we are, in terms of where we're going next week, we have a double top in the Qs. Now, I want to point out that that's a double top, but it's not a double top from a technical perspective until we break down, which would be trading below this 348 area. And because we certainly could trade above this. We had a double top right here in the spiders, but it was negated when we traded above that level once again. And then we've got a double top from the close yesterday to the open today. So I'm really unsure as to what we're going to see now. In terms of trade positioning, I'm going to be very cautious next week because CPI numbers and Fed interest rate announcements are going to drive this market probably hugely. Now, keep in mind that while breadth was down in the latter part of this week, the percentage of stocks moving above their 15-200-day moving averages exploded. So it's going to be interesting to see how that is reconciled. Looking to be long above today's high in the spiders in the coming week. I'm going to be cautious. I might short this below about 428, but certainly I want to look to be short below the 426 level, and I'm going to be cautious to make sure that this gap is closed. That's pretty convictive buying that came in on that day. And the same thing with the Qs. We want to be long above this double top here. And then certainly if you're day trading, you could be short below about 353, but certainly short below about 348 if that occurs. And then in the Russell, I'm going to be looking at the 184 area for a possible short. I think the Russell's gotten ahead of itself, but that's yet to be seen. And I just want to point this out. This is a 60-minute chart. You can see this move here. This is volume in the IWM, and you can see how it was increasing going into approximately the high. Then we got a slight new highs right through here, volume falling off. Then we had some volume coming in on this move to the downside. But from there on, volume has fallen off pretty dramatically in the Russell. So we may be able to take our cues from what happens in the IWM next week. But keep in mind, I would keep tight stops on any position, whether short or long, especially in front of Wednesday's news announcement, 8:30 for the CPI, and I think it's 2 p.m. Eastern time for the Fed announcement. Have a great weekend.